Hello, gentlemen. Spring has sprung, and I've been taking advantage of the nice weather to get some projects done and prepare for the summer. So it's been a couple of weeks since I've made a video, but now I'm back at it. I was hoping to cover this topic with one video, but as I was doing research, it became apparent that it's going to take multiple parts. Yeah, at least 2 or 3 parts. And that's because there's a lot of background information to cover and a lot of groundwork to lay before delving deep into the subject. Now, in order to predict and prepare for the future, men must at least have a fundamental understanding of their surroundings and the environment in which they live. If I were to draw a Venn diagram of modern Western society, it would be comprised of 3 sets or spheres: social, political, and economic. And in the overlap of the Venn diagram, gynocentrism can be found. We should be warning all men of the increasing dangers they face, and why society seems all too willing to use them up and spit them out. Some men seem to be blissfully unaware of the perils around them. While being self-aware is great, it's not enough. We as men also need to be aware of our surroundings, especially aware of the various hazards all around us. We need to have an understanding of why the society we live in is the way it is. Let's begin by talking about the political sphere or realm of our society. I want to preface what I'm about to say by letting you know that I'm apolitical. That is to say that although I stay abreast of issues regarding politics and I exercise my right to vote, I believe our government/political system no longer functions to serve the people, but instead is foremost concerned with amassing as much wealth and power as possible. And this dysfunctional political system that has done precious little for the common citizen in the last 50 to 100 years is perpetuated by the major political parties. These parties, in my opinion, are just flip sides of the same coin. They have distracted us from the real issues, and we remain stuck in this perpetual stalemate in which the significant issues are never properly identified, much less solved, due to the polarizing way of labeling those with differing viewpoints. You know, right wing, left wing, conservative, liberal, and so forth. All the while, our politicians scapegoat each other into oblivion, living high off the hog for essentially doing nothing, leaving the masses squabbling over scraps that fall off the table. People have become so intransigent in their political camps. Everyone around them thinks like them, dresses like them, acts like them, and they think their little group is the world. So anybody who doesn't think like them becomes an anarchist, a Marxist, an evil capitalist, rather than understanding that one's position is merely one perspective in a much bigger world in which mature people learn how to fit in with people who think different from them. We have traded the idea of public servants for false idols of political power and privilege. You see, that's how our government keeps us ignorant, powerless, and blind and distracted. I think the best description of government I've ever heard was given by Barbarossaa in one of his videos a while back. Quote, "Government is a social organism, which at any given time is involved in a symbiotic relationship with its people. This symbiosis can be defined as parasitic mutualism, and the state, i.e. government, is demonstratively parasitic off its own people. Statesmen, realizing they can forcibly collect monies from their countrymen while doing comparatively little in terms of productive work in comparison to their countrymen, will by virtue of human nature seek to perpetuate their employment at the expense of their own countrymen. In other words, the life of a politician is a comfortable one. It's an easy gig. So individual selfishness dictates that the politician will perpetuate the power and luxury his or her occupation provides. The group dynamic we observe in this social organism of government as a result of individual parasitic instincts of politician is the tendency towards growth. With that said, one should consider the futility of claiming that our social economic woes can be eliminated by merely reducing the size of government." Close quote. Now keep in mind this concept of the state or government as a parasitic social organism with a natural tendency towards growth. Also keep in mind that previous Venn diagram, the overlapping between the political, economic, and social. Let's take the Tea Party movement, for example, who swept into power in 2010 with the mantra of tax enough already. Now when they came into office, they had some zeal and fervor, and they proposed a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, which got quickly batted down by both political parties. And then after that, you didn't see much steam about lowering taxes. And then there was the rhetoric about serving in Congress being an honor, not a career, and the founding fathers envisioning citizen legislators, and you serve your term and then go home and go back to work. And that, talk of term limits, that quickly died down and was replaced with other distractive hyperbole. So all the talk from even so-called conservative politicians about lower taxes and limited government is just that, talk, empty rhetoric. So what are the mechanisms or means by which politicians, both as individuals and collectively as this social organism we call government, how do they acquire resources they need not only to stay in power, but to grow and grow wealthy? Franz Oppenheimer, a 20th century psychologist and political economist, in his analysis of the origin of the state, argues that there are two fundamental opposing ways of acquiring wealth. The, quote, political means through coercion, and the, quote, economic means through peaceful trade. In his book titled The State, which was first published in Germany in 1908, and then later in English in 1922, he states, there are two fundamental opposing means whereby man acquiring subsistence is impelled to obtain the necessary means for satisfying his desires. These are work and robbery, one's own labor, and the forcible appropriation of labor of others. I propose the following discussion to call one's own labor and the equivalent exchange of one's own labor for the labor of others the, quote, economic means, and the satisfaction of needs, while the unrequited appropriation of the labor of others will be called the political means. In just a second, we'll look at some recent examples of how the state uses what Franz Oppenheimer calls political means, i.e. coercion and force, to acquire and amass wealth and power. But basically, there are two main things that politicians need to get elected and stay in power. Number one is money, and number two is votes. The fact that the majority, approximately 51% of the electorate, is female, obviously makes women a powerful demographic voting bloc. However, the connection between the economics of politics and gynocentrism is not easy to discern. But for now, it suffices to say that campaign contributions come from special interest and lobbying groups, and said campaign contributions are the most important factor in winning elections. It's all about who can outspend the opposition. Several months ago, I had a conversation with a female friend about the yes means yes law. There's been a lot of press coverage about this law, but for those who haven't heard about the law, rather than using the refrain no means no, the definition of consent under the bill requires an affirmative, unambiguous, and conscious decision by each party to engage in sexual activity. Okay, I'm going to read part of this law. It says, in order to receive state funds for student financial assistance, the governing board of each community college district, the trustees of California State University, the regents of the University of California, and the governing boards of independent post-secondary institutions shall adopt a policy concerning sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, as defined in the Federal Higher Education Act of 1965, involving the student both on and off campus. The policy shall include the following: an affirmative consent standard and determination of whether consent was given by both parties to sexual activity. Affirmative consent means affirmative, conscious, voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. It is the responsibility of each person involved in the sexual activity to ensure that he or she has the affirmative consent of the other or others to engage in sexual activity. Lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent, nor does silence mean consent. Affirmative consent must be ongoing throughout a sexual activity and can be revoked at any time. The existence of a dating relationship between persons involved, or the fact of past sexual relationships between them, should never by itself be assumed to be an indicator of consent. Now, the measure applies to all colleges and universities accepting state financial aid. Schools nationwide are in the process of rewriting or have already rewritten their sexual assault policies, procedures, and prevention education programs to meet standards in the Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act that took effect in 2013 as part of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. Now, I'm in no way criticizing the original intent of the Violence Against Women Act. No sane person would quarrel with the principle that sex without consent is rape and should be severely punished. Nonetheless, having the government codify a standard that may implicitly criminalize most human sexual interaction is a very bad idea. I'm not going to delve into the particulars of the yes means yes law. There's a plethora of articles and YouTube videos on the problems with this law. Instead, I want to focus on the funding aspect of this legislation, which will shed light on the motivations behind it. The Violence Against Women Act of 1994, VAWA, which I'll call VAWA, is a United States federal law, Title IV, Section 4001-40703 of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, H.R. 3355, signed by then-President Bill Clinton on September 13, 1994. When Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, it was a landmark in federally recognizing the scourge of domestic violence. It also brought about a very practical change meant to address the problem of cops treating such cases as private family matters instead of serious crimes. With grant funding as a reward and with the backing of many leaders in the battered women's movement, VAWA encouraged states to adopt mandatory arrest policies that allowed domestic violence cases to move forward without the cooperation of victims. Also, nearly 20 years later, with the reauthorization of VAWA, a vocal group of researchers and advocates questioned whether VAWA's original intent to make law enforcement the primary tool to stop domestic violence was the right approach. VAWA focuses on law enforcement, reduces the really more complicated thing of violence against women to be a problem of the law, says Bethy Ritchie, a psychologist and professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago who studies violence against women. It's not just a problem of the law. VAWA has increased prosecution rates of domestic violence cases, but there is little conclusive evidence that it has significantly reduced the incidences of domestic violence. According to the Department of Justice, DOJ, the rate of intimate partner violence has dropped 64% between 1994 and 2010. A drop pro-VAWA policymakers largely contribute to the law. But this decrease happened at the same time violent crime as a whole fell dramatically nationwide, making it hard to know whether a drop in domestic violence might have happened without policies adopted under VAWA. The 2012/2013 reauthorization of this act provides $1.6 billion, that's billion with a B, towards investigating and prosecution of violent crimes against women, imposes automatic and mandatory restitution on those convicted, and allows civil regress in cases prosecutors chose to leave unprosecuted. So that's something to take note of, so that if the accused is not prosecuted in criminal court, say that it goes to a grand jury even, and the grand jury doesn't find enough evidence to prosecute, the funding under VAWA provides for the alleged victims to sue the alleged perpetrators in civil court. The act also establishes an Office of Violence Against Women within the Department of Justice. Many grant programs authorized in VAWA have been funded under the U.S. Congress. The following grant programs, which are administrated primarily through the Office of Violence Against Women in the U.S. Department of Justice, have received appropriations from Congress. These grants include STOP grants, state formula grants, transitional housing grants, grants to encourage arrest and enforcement protection orders, court-ordered training and improvement grants, research on violence against Native American women, National Tribal Sex Offender Registry, Stalker Reduction Database, Federal Victim Assistance, Sexual Assault Services Program, Services for Rural Victims, Legal Assistance for Victims, Elderly Abuse Grant Program, Protection and Services for Disabled Victims, Combating Abuse in Public Housing, National Resource Center on Workplace Responses, Violence on College Campuses Grants, Safe Haven Project. During the first 5 years of VAWA, over $1.8 billion was appropriated for grant programs. This includes programs administered by both the U.S. Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services. Through STOP, Services Training Officers and Prosecutors, formula grant programs alone from 1995 to 2000 in excess of $440 million was awarded to support 9,000 different projects. Yeah, you heard it right, 9,000 different projects. Beginning in 1997, sexual and domestic violence advocacy organizations and activists met to discuss strategies for continuing VAWA and formed a committee to draft a new version of the bill. Their effort resulted in a bill that identified necessary technical amendments, created new grant programs, and increased authorization levels for existing grant programs. Remember that thing about government being a social organism, a parasitic organism with a propensity for growth? VAWA 2 received tremendous support from Congress. Introduced on January 19, 1999, it passed by nearly a unanimous vote in the House of Representatives on October 6th, 371-1, and a unanimous vote in the Senate on October 11th. It was finally signed into law by President Bill Clinton on October 28th. VAWA 2 authorized $3.3 billion for fiscal years 2000 through 2005, representing a significant increase over the previous VAWA. Crime rates have been declining for many years now, and as we just mentioned, there's a debate on whether VAWA actually was a major contributor to the decline of domestic violence or if there were other factors. A January 2012 article in the Christian Science Monitor pointed this out. Author Daniel B. Wood, staff writer, explains that the rates for serious crimes, including murder, rape, and assault, has dropped significantly since the early 1990s, in part because of changes in technology and policing. However, public perception is being influenced to believe the opposite is true. Mr. Wood explains in an article, U.S. crime rate at lowest point in decades, why America is safer now. Quote, in many police departments across the U.S., changes during the past decade or more are hard to overstate, say many law enforcement experts. Technology has given detectives powerful new tools with which to analyze blood and DNA samples or other forensic evidence, for instance. With the advent of computerized hotspots, crime mapping has also helped police connect the dots in ways that were more difficult before, from pushpins to databases. The data points to a persistent perception gap among Americans. Despite strong evidence of crime dropping over recent decades, the public sees the reverse. Recent Gallup polls have found that citizens overwhelmingly feel that crime is going up even though it's not. This is because of the growth of crime shows and the way that TV spotlights the emotional. One case of a random horrific shooting shown repeatedly on TV has a more visceral effect than all the statistics printed in a newspaper. Now let's look at the hard data from the FBI and Justice Department. As illustrated in this graph, aggravated assault, forcible rape, and violent crime, including domestic violence, has declined over the past couple of decades from 1994 to 2012. And here I have some tables kind of summarizing the data. Violent crime per 100,000 people in 1994 was 713.6. In 2012, that rate dropped to 386.9. Forcible rape per 100,000 people in 1994 was 39.3, and in 2012 that rate declined to 26.9. Now, this represents a 46% decline in the violent crime rate, and that includes domestic violence. In forcible rape, it represents a 32% decline. But as previously stated, proponents of VAWA claim that, because of underreporting prior to 1994, the real decline is about 60%. But let's just split the difference and say and estimate that forcible rape since 1994 has declined 50%. Now let's look at the funding. VAWA 1, which represents the period of 1995 to 2000, had an authorized funding of $1.6 billion. VAWA 2, representing the time period from 2000 to 2005, had a funding of $3.3 billion. Now that's a 106% increase in funding, even though violent crime and forcible rape decreased by over 30%. So the next question is, where does all this funding go? Let's take a look at a VAWA budget breakdown. There's a couple of interesting numbers I want to point out on this appropriations table. The first one is, actually both of them are in fiscal year 2015. Look at the budget for civil legal assistance for victims. There's $42.5 million budgeted. That's just to go to civil trial lawyers so that alleged victims can sue in civil court even if the accused hasn't been charged with a crime. The Yes Means Yes bill, also known as SB 967, is part of the 2013 Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, and this legislation, which has become law, requires all private and public post-secondary schools in California receiving state funding to implement a policy of affirmative consent. This means participants in sexual acts will need to constantly get consent throughout the act in order to avoid potential rape and sexual assault charges. The problem with this bill is that it's too vague and subjective. It also puts the burden of proof on the accused. The law, and I use the term loosely, circumvents due process and forces the accused to prove that he continually asked a woman for sexual consent during the act itself. Let's be clear here. Although the language of the law was allegedly crafted to be gender neutral, we all know the target is men and boys. I don't know how many of you have read Atlas Shrugged. It's kind of a long book. It's over 1,100 pages. It's fiction, but it's not really fiction. It's more like philosophy couched in fiction. And in it, there's this fictional character, Dr. Ferris, and he's talking about how government uses its power. There's no way to rule innocent men. The only power any government has is the power to crack down on criminals. Well, when there aren't enough criminals, one makes them. One declares so many things to be a crime that it becomes impossible for men to live without breaking laws. Who wants a nation of law-abiding citizens? What's there in that for anyone? But just pass the kind of laws that can neither be observed nor enforced nor objectively interpreted, and you create a nation of lawbreakers, and then you cash in on guilt. Now that's the system. Now this book was published in 1957, but it could have been written in 2007. And if you haven't read this book, I would highly recommend that you do. It seems the more rape declines, the more rape is falsely alleged, and the more legislation is expanded to, quote, prevent it. Consider for a moment the expansion of the definition of consent in the wake of proven false rape allegations, including cases like the Duke Lacrosse players and the recent monumental Rolling Stone magazine hoax at UVA, and how dangerous this redefinition of consent and rape is to men. Bottom line is rape culture and domestic violence is big business. From PR firms generating public awareness campaigns to workshops proliferated in college campuses such as Ask First, Ask Often, and Bear Pack, and special task forces within the DOJ. And don't forget about all those civil trial lawyers who get a huge slice of the billion-dollar pie. Stay tuned for part 2.